Okay, so welcome everyone to our Learning from Ethiopia talk series. We're very happy that you could join us. This is our fourth talk of this series, and we are very happy to have Tarn here to talk about the Rockhewn churches of Ethiopia and hopefully teach us something new. We also have here Binyam, the chair of the Untitled Ethiopian chapter. We have Juliet, the main programs coordinator for Untitled in general. And everybody else, welcome. Feel free to type in the chat where you're from, any questions you have, just let us know. It's also good for us to see who's there and who of any of your opinions. We're very happy to hear that. I think I will pass it on to Binyam now to introduce Tarn and tell you a little bit about Intibaut and what we stand for. So Binyam, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mina. Intibaut Ethiopia is the newly established, I think, probably the latest addition to the Intibaut network. And within our chapter and Intibaut in general, we seek to promote traditional building, urbanism, traditional building, architecture and urbanism, and local building practices. And there are multiple ways in which we try to do that. And this talk series of the Ethiopian chapter is one way of initiating a discussion in and around local building cultures, of course, focusing on Ethiopia. And the series has been running for some months now. We're already today on the fourth talk. That's really interesting. Our today's speaker would be Tarn. Of course, I'll introduce him shortly. But before that, I want to remind everyone that if you want to become a member, Mina would be sharing the link, and you can do so by filling this simple form. You will have it in the chat box quite soon, I hope. And then, of course, while Tarn is speaking, feel free to type your questions or reflections in the chat. And yeah, I think Mina, other than the membership link, should be also sharing our social media links, which you can follow for to find out about more what we do. Yeah, so that's about it. And about our today's speaker, Tarn Philip. Yeah, he's a South African-born, London-based architect and independent researcher. He has visited Ethiopia in 2014, and he's been returning since then to undertake research. Adam Architecture Travel Scholarship, which he received in 2015, and the Arcadia Fund Research Project from 2016 until 2020. He's also a recipient of the Venice Biennale Research Fellowship of 2018 and the AJ Small Projects Sustainable Project Award in 2020. Prior to this talk, he has presented his research on numerous occasions, including International Conference of Ethiopian Studies in 2018, Artworks Guide in 2016, and London Festival of Architecture in 2019. And Anglo-Ethiopian Society in 2019. Yeah. In today's talk, he will share his findings from his fieldwork research from 2015 until 2020 to offer us some insight into the craft of new rock-hewn churches and explore whether this resurgence represents a revival or a continuation of this stone carving or rock-hewn churches that exist in the northern country, in the northern part of the country in Ethiopia. So over to you, Tarn.
Thank you, Binyam. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you to all of you for the invitation, and Inbal as well for sort of allowing us to have this platform. and it's very nice to see a lot of familiar faces. Sorry we can't all be in the same room, but all right. So yeah, I think Binyam's already given quite a big background. As he mentioned, I sort of first traveled to Ethiopia in 2014 and returned in 2015 with the sort of a modest scholarship from Adam Architecture. And since then, I've been working with a professor from Toronto University, Michael Jervis, who I think is here, and we've been looking specifically at new rock-hewn churches, which are being carved. And so I thought I'd start with this quote, which is by a British architect who actually travelled to the region in the late 60s and early 70s, and recorded a lot of churches in Tigray, in northern Ethiopia, where there's over 120 rock-hewn churches. I guess, yeah, and not everyone, I don't know if everyone's aware of the sort of current political situation in Ethiopia, particularly Tigray, but this sort of quote is quite pertinent. Yeah, during this sort of she was there till 1974, and then there was the rise of the Derg, which effectively meant that travel in Ethiopia was very difficult, and yeah, she wasn't actually able to return. So I think, yeah, a big part of the motivation to sort of go to Ethiopia was the sort of the fact that there's sort of the possibility of unknown or unrecorded rock-hewn churches, and the possibility that new ones are being carved as well. So yeah, in 2015, it was sort of a modest scholarship, traveled on local transport. I spent 6 weeks in Ethiopia and was able to visit sort of 24, 25 sites and produce measured drawings as well. And I guess it was during this time that I sort of realized that new rock churches are actually being carved, and that's when I sort of began working with Michael Jervis from Toronto University. So I apologize for those of you that are maybe more familiar with Ethiopian Christian history, but I thought it'd be useful to give sort of an overview before talking more specifically about Ethiopian churches, and then finally new rock-hewn churches, which is sort of what I'm really interested in. So this is a quote by Francisco Alvarez, who's a Portuguese explorer, who's the first foreigner to at least describe seeing the churches at Lalibela, which I imagine most of you are familiar with, but there's basically a complex of 11 churches which are carved, sunk into the rock. And the reason I put this quote up here is because I think for many people that have sort of traveled to Lalibela since, I think a lot of what he's sort of said really rings true. It's absolutely remarkable and awe-inspiring space. So it's important to note that while the churches at Lalibela are cut downward into the rock, as the image on the left, the churches in Tigray in the north are actually carved horizontally into the rock. So there's effectively two sort of primary types of rock-hewn church. And I guess owing to the fact that these churches are carved from a single material within the rock or mountain, they take on highly sculptural qualities. So for anyone traveling to Ethiopia today, I think one of the first things you'll realize, depending when you visit, is that it's a lot greener than you might have imagined. Another thing that you will sort of soon realize is that Christianity is alive and well and very much embedded in sort of everyday life. And I've put a little question mark there of the date at the top. Yeah, basically the Ethiopian calendar is derived from one of the Coptic Egyptians, and is effectively 7 years behind the Gregorian calendar. And I think that's just sort of the reason I put that there is just to kind of reiterate the sort of age-old relationship that Ethiopia has with the ancient world, and particularly sort of Egypt and Israel. So going back to sort of 1000 BC, so 3000 years ago, a group of settlers referred to as the Sabians sort of migrated from Arabia and settled on the east coast of Africa near modern-day Aksum. And while they brought sort of, or possibly brought some of their sort of own building traditions with them, what's really interesting is that the subsequent civilization that emerged in Aksum really represents, or seems to represent, a real coming together of indigenous and foreign culture. And this is expressed both in the language of Gez, which emerged, but particularly in the architecture as well. So the image at the top right is the Temple of Ea, which is close to Aksum, that dates from this 700 BC. So over 2,500 years old, and it shows sort of similar, quite clear similarities to a lot of temples throughout the Middle East. What's interesting is with the rise of Aksum, so sort of around 2,000 years ago, you begin to get a new sort of vernacular form of construction, which is not found outside the region. And some of the better examples of these are these large sort of square palaces, which are still ruins in Aksum today. And then this sort of very particular form of construction which developed. And I guess just while we're on the map, I guess it's just very important to highlight the relationship that Ethiopia has with the Red Sea, which meant, sort of from the earliest of times, it was very much in contact with the merchants, whether those were Greek, Roman, Indian, etc. It was very much connected with the wider ancient world, and of course with Egypt and Israel to the north. So if you go to Aksum today, this is the one of the palaces near Aksum, and I guess what's interesting is that the palace is sort of could be seen as a combination of these two kind of cultures. So you've got the steps of the pediment at the entrance of the palace, but then this sort of Aksumite construction. Sorry, and just to explain on the bottom there, Aksumite construction is effectively sort of horizontal bands of small stones bonded together with mortar, with horizontal timbers running the length of the wall, and then above that there's cross members which protrude to form what are called monkey heads above, and to sort of deal with openings, sort of the incohesive nature of these stone walls. This Aksumite sort of frame detail emerged, which again has protruding elements at the corners. And so again, another sort of key sort of surviving memory of the Aksumite civilization of the stelae, which are sort of quite well known. I guess what's interesting about these is that they basically immortalize in rock the built construction of the time. So if we look again at this Aksumite detail with these protruding corner elements, you realize that effectively this is almost a monument to Aksumite architecture or construction. And these are pre-Christians. At the top you can see there's the crescent. The Aksumite Empire sort of grew to prominence, and in 341 AD it adopted Christianity. It was the second state to do so after Romania. And there's evidence of this sort of specific date is found on coins which are found in Aksum during the reign of Empress King Azana, and the coins at the beginning of his reign sort of depict pagan symbols, and then after his conversion bear the cross. So sort of moving on from that, in the 5th and 6th centuries, that's really when Christianity cemented itself in the region, and that was through the arrival of 9 saints, thought to be mostly from sort of Greater Syria, and possibly coming through Egypt. And they sort of founded monasteries both in and around Aksum. And what's interesting is that the sort of Aksumite form of construction continued to be used in these built churches. This is Debre Dammar, which is from the 6th century, one of a few surviving built examples. So sort of around the 7th century, with the rise of Islam, the Arabs effectively took control of the Red Sea, and the Aksumite Empire sort of became cut off on the, I guess, sort of the trade that it depended on. And it's sort of during this time, so this is a map on the left showing Christian Ethiopia, sort of in the 14th century. And what's important to note is just how sort of isolated it is from the rest of the Christian world, effectively. So sort of from this point onwards, you start to find a lot of churches in some very isolated places, and possibly then the sort of establishment of the first Rockhewn churches. So this is a little bit later, but this image on the left is on the 12th century church in Bahara, called Yomerhana Christos, not far from Lalibela. And what's interesting to note is that it's the same construction. So this is more than 1,000 years after the Aksum Stele, but it's the same construction. In this case, the small stones have been plastered over. And what's interesting at Lalibela is, again, so that's thought to be carved around the 13th century, at least according to sort of oral tradition. It again is immortalizing this form of construction. So you've got a continued form of construction for sort of over 1,000 years at least. So I'll speak a little bit more just about churches. I guess I've mentioned some of the influence, but the image on the left is really highlighting the influence of Syria. So this was through sort of through sort of the 9 saints who arrived there, but also the adaptation of the Syrian basilica in early churches. And there's also, I guess, with that, a strong influence from Egypt. There's also a strong influence from Greece, and that's actually pre-Christian, so that there was worship in Aksum of sort of Greek gods. And the image on the right, I think, is probably among one of the most important. So this is the Star of David. And just to highlight that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is sort of very much rooted in the Old Testament. I won't go into the story of Queen Shiva, but or maybe I should just mention if people don't know. But yeah, so I guess the important link is Queen Shiva. This is sort of during the time of Solomon, so almost 3,000 years ago. Ethiopian oral tradition sort of asserts that she traveled to Jerusalem to meet Solomon, and on return to Ethiopia, she bore a son who was then became King Menelik, and he later traveled to Jerusalem to visit his father Solomon, and returned back to Ethiopia with the Ark of the Covenant. And Ethiopians believe that this is kept in Aksum, in Mariam Zion. And it's a very important part of sort of Ethiopian orthodoxy. So again, continuing on from that, this is Solomon's Temple on the top left, and then the early sort of rectangular basilica-built church on the top right, and then sort of later on, it seems possibly around the 17th century, there's formation of a circular-built church. And then a rectangular church sort of parallel to that. So basically every Ethiopian church includes these 3 key religious spaces. So the first is the Kanamalet, which is sort of the entrance or the anteroom to the church, and that corresponds to the Ulam in Solomon's Temple. The second space is the Kedist, or the body of the church, and then the third part is the Makdos, or sanctuary. And again, you can see every church includes these spaces, and it's almost always orientated towards the east as well. And then just to note, within this, so within the Makdos, the sanctuary, there's a Mambara Tabot, which is an altar, and in or on that you have the Tabot, which is a replica of the Ark of the tablet, so of the Ark of the Covenant, and that's within every church. And I guess just to note that it's the Tabot which is consecrated, not the church. So if the Tabot was to be moved from that church, it would sort of effectively lose its sanctity in some way. So I guess moving on from built churches, this is the example I showed earlier, but the reason this church survives is largely due to the fact that it's located within a large cave, and so this is dating from the 12th century. A sort of possible progression from this is a built church within a cave, but in this case, the rear of the cave and the sort of roof overhead has been carved as well. So on the left, you've got the built nave at the first church at Yomerhana Christos, and on the right, built sort of columns below, but the roof of the nave is actually carved from the mouth of the cave. And moving on from that, you then sort of get a completely rock-hewn church. In this case, it seems that the front of the church has possibly fallen away and been built up, but it's effectively within the rock. So just to kind of reiterate the location of these churches sort of is quite amazing in itself, so often very isolated. This is Abba Salama, so this is basically Fermentis, so the person who's sort of attributed with introducing Christianity. And this is the monastery, and this purple band of rock along here is basically where you've got to walk along this ledge, and then there's a kind of a crevice which is about 20 meters high, which you need to then sort of ascend. So it's quite difficult to get to some of these places. Of course, people who sort of have grown up there, it's no problem. So I guess rock churches, largely due to the fact that they carve within sort of within the natural landscape, and possibly intentionally trying to sort of conceal themselves from possibly a Muslim threat. They do tend to almost omit a facade, so have very few openings. There are some examples which sort of include a frontage structure, as the middle one on the right, and then there are, of course, churches which have a sort of more expressed facade. And I think the fact that there are relatively few openings really kind of adds to or heightens the experience of entering these spaces, which are then often richly carved and with really beautiful paintings as well. So again, just to sort of reiterate, there can be a lot of architectural details. These, again, ones on the left, sort of blind arcading, could be seen to derive from the apex of the Axonite stellae. One on the right just highlights sort of the variety of roof structures that appear, and so sort of the underside of a boat on the top right, and then domes or cupolas at the bottom right. And just to maybe highlight that these are often not structural, so they're sort of purely artistic or decorative. Okay, so this is another example of an older Rockhewn church, thought to date from sort of around the 10th century. And I guess what's important to note with this is that it's effectively a square basilica plan, but in this case, a sanctuary has been carved to the east, a central noctus. And then you've also got this colonnade on the left, which is sort of slightly peculiar and interesting. So again, just to give you an idea of the interior of the space, the raised nave with sort of carved ceiling and what's known as an Axomite frieze running along. And also, just to sort of highlight the combination of different roof structures found within this same church. So the fact that it's not built means that there can be a variety of sort of almost an idea adaptation, or sort of borrowing different forms of construction and kind of immortalizing them within one rock, within one space. So these are just some elevation drawings. The one on the left sort of showing it before. Sorry, the one on the left showing it with the portico as it is now, and the one on the right without the sort of built portico, which appears to have been added later on. And I think while the plans are very useful, I think section drawings are probably really helpful in explaining these churches in relation to just explaining how these churches sort of sit within the rock face of the landscape. Again, this is another church. This is the church of Mariam Bahara, and it's located at the bottom of a large cliff. And in this case, is a large frontage structure which has been built later, which has effectively doubled the size of the church. And in this case, as at many others, the paintings have been whitewashed over, possibly due to a fire at some point. And in 2015, I was actually able to visit this church while there were two British wall painting conservationists busy uncovering the paintings. And the Tavot was temporarily moved to another church, which meant I sort of had free access and unlimited time to sort of spend within the church. And again, these are section drawings just highlighting the relationship of this church at the foot of this large cliff. Maybe just worth mentioning. So according to Ethiopian oral tradition, most rock churches date from sort of the 4th century, often sort of attributed to kings or sort of saints. This is sort of looking at a possible architectural progression, so not necessarily based in dates, but looking at, I guess from the top left, sort of a square basilica, which is quite similar to some of the earlier built churches, as well as the Axomite palace. You then sort of have the introduction of a central noctis to the east, possible sort of lateral chambers to the left or right. You then get churches with sort of more than one sanctuary. And finally, sort of the sixth image here, you've got an ambulatory passage, the tunnel effectively carved around the church to allow access from sort of the west, the north, and the south. And then this is a further progression of this with an ambulatory passage, but in this case, the rock overhead has been removed, so it's effectively a trench circumnavigating the church. And finally, you then get what are referred to as the Tigray cross and square churches, which sort of have a large courtyard to the west of the church, which partially exposes the north and south elevation. I guess you can see there's quite a variety of church plans that emerge, and I think this is something that's kind of common in Ethiopian Rockhewn architecture. It sort of adapts to the way the church might be orientated within the rock, as well as to where, in some cases you might come across a piece of granite and have to sort of change the course of the work. And finally, you then get these sort of monolithic churches, which are sort of more known, and Lalibela, which are cut completely downward into the rock and sort of fully exposed. So we'll now move on to sort of new Rockhewn churches. So as I noted, in 2015, I visited this site, which is sort of about 2.5 meters tall. The entrance is on the left, and I sort of thought this is an interesting space. So it was under excavation, and it was sort of only after the craftsman sort of explained to me what was actually going on, is that I realised what sort of looks like seats at the rear of the wall is actually the top of capitals, and the columns are yet to be carved below. I think also maybe important to note there's sort of the use of strings, so quite sort of basic forms of construction. String with a stick used to mark out the dome overhead. And again, here you can see these columns which have been worked from top to bottom. Still rough at the bottom. So as William mentioned, I returned to Ethiopia in 2016, or I've been returning since 2016, working with Michael Jervis on an Arcadia-funded project, also with Tarn University, and this has been part of a much larger team. I'll say a little bit more about this possibly later, but I guess the aim of the project is really to document the craft of new Rockhewn churches, so both through photography, architectural drawings. So far we've measured over 40 sites, but also to sort of record the craft through video interviews, both with the craftsman and priests responsible. So in some ways, this way someone's taken on sort of an anthropological like nature. And so if anyone's interested, this is the sort of online database with Toronto University, which you can access, and you'll then have sort of all the sites arranged under sites in the 3 key regions, and then sort of sub-regions or districts, and then a series of churches that are found within that area. And again, on each of the sites, there's sort of a brief site description. We've then got videos, any relevant videos, in this case, with the craftsman, with the priest, and with the nun responsible for raising money for the church, as well as photos and then drawings. So that's just to give you a sort of a sense of what's there, and that's all, sort of all open resource, freely accessible. I guess, important to note that the researchers sort of identified 3 key areas. So in Tigray in the north, Shiva, and North Wallo, both in Bahara region. But there seems to be these sort of 3 main clusters of new rock churches. And it's worth adding that there seems to have, sort of the phenomenon of new rock churches really seems to have happened within the last 30 years. That there's no kind of evidence to suggest that churches were being carved before that. So the sort of common understanding is that they were sort of carved possibly until the 15th century, and it seems that within the last 30 years there's sort of a revival, and a big part of this research was to try and establish whether the this is the case, or whether there was sort of a continued unbroken tradition. But of course, given that often people in the areas are, are sort of unaware that there might be a rock-hewn church being carved, it's quite hard to locate. So you can see what looks like a landslide. There's actually the excavation of a church underway. And yeah, I guess similar to sort of how I started, but just to reiterate, that's that church in the background, that what looks like white's sort of a landslide. That's where a new church has been carved. And I guess just to highlight that this forms sort of a backdrop to everyday life in sort of rural Ethiopia. So yeah, new rock-hewn churches can be, I guess, defined in two main categories. The first is sort of an expansion of an existing old church or replacement of a built structure, and the second is an entirely new church. I guess it's important to note that all churches will include a source of holy water. So in many ways, the sites have been in use, sort of for some time. They're not entirely new. Sorry, I've got some notes for this, so I'll try and. So I guess, yeah, going on to discuss sort of the embodied knowledge related to these structures. If embodied knowledge is neither preserved in written or oral form, how else might it survive but through physical manifestation? That is, through the architecture itself. Ancestral achievements serve as a vocation for current craftsmen. This indirect, intergenerational dialogue presents an unusual form of embodied knowledge and transfer of skill. So the resurgent present-day craftsmen are self-taught, necessitating the relearning and possible reappropriation of the forgotten craft. However, the use of primitive handheld tools suggests a method likely employed in medieval and ancient churches. Of particular interest is the apparent resurgence of the craft across Christian Ethiopia, from Tigray in the north to Bahara and Oromia in the south. Responsible craftsmen and priests are usually unaware of the practice locally, let alone in another linguistically differentiated region. The simultaneous resurgence of the craft in apparent isolation supports that the craft may indeed represent intermittent practice rather than a total revival. Arcadia-funded research has fortunately yielded a significant number of active craftsmen. Those in the Bahara region tend to be solely driven by religious vocation, often choosing to distance themselves from society and carve single-handedly. Typically, as work progresses, support from the community grows and contributions are made in the form of provisions. In contrast, craftsmen in Tigray are often employed on a contract-like basis by a representative of the church or local community. This in turn has led to the emergence of master craftsmen, or individuals who have worked in several churches. The process of creating a rock-hewn church has long been assumed as top-to-bottom excavation. The initial point of entry later forms an upper window as the craftsmen continue to carve the church below. At the freestanding courtyard churches of Lalibela, both exterior and interior are thought to have been carved simultaneously in this manner. While the majority of newly identified sites do employ this method, the opposite has also been recorded. At Mariam Shuito in Tigray, having broken into the rock by means of an entrance, the excavated slag forms a platform from which the craftsmen continue to carve overhead. On achieving the desired height and having completed any carved patterns to the ceiling, upper walls and column shafts, the slag is then removed to expose the church in its entirety. So again, these are just some photos of churches under excavation. And this is just, yeah, so I guess just to highlight that there's sort of two forms of carving a church. The one on the left is top to bottom, and on the right is bottom to top. So you can sort of get an idea of the way this works. So I think I've probably dwelled on this, but it's important to note that the inspiration of new rock churches, as suggested by their function, is largely due to religious motive. While the contracted craftsmen of Tigray are financially driven, they, as the village communities that fund their work, are devout Christians. And this is the saint day of Abrowatspa, or Zana in Tigray in 2014. And this is more recently. This was in this is Timkat in Abiadi in Tembien, which this was in January, February last year. So more sort of recent. So while most new churches in Tigray borrow their form from the basilica, churches in Bahara do not. These southerly churches tend to lack a level of sophistication and attention to detail, evident in old Rockhewn churches. Exceptions are the church at Etissa, Meskaba Kudusan Medhanyalem near Seladingo, and the ambitious Dagmari church complex near Gashena. The church plan at Etissa is noteworthy, as it is the only rock church to reflect the relatively recent Ethiopian rectangular built church, a development of the basilica that places the Maktas centrally rather than at the far east. So this is a site near Gashena in Amara, and yeah, it's called Dagmari Lalibela. So in addition to a religious motive, the Dagmari Complex demonstrates a strong political and social agenda. The principal craftsman, Gebre Meskel Tsema, describes the project as a reaction to views that question the authenticity of the churches at Lalibela, suggesting that foreigners were responsible for their creation. By understanding the immense task of carving 10 churches using primitive tools and techniques, he hopes to demonstrate that Ethiopians were and are capable of carving such structures. The Dagmari Lalibela complex strives to restore a sense of pride and traditionalism in the Ethiopian way of life, and to educate and remind Ethiopians of the importance of their heritage, something rapidly being lost to Western influence. The abundant relief carvings continue this argument and form a narrative of the past and present achievements of Ethiopia. So the Dagmari Lali complex presently consists of 5 subterranean churches, which are connected by open courtyards, short passageways, and trenches, so quite comparable to nearby Lalibela. The site demonstrates a high level of craftsmanship seldom realized in newly carved churches. The variety and unusual arrangement of spaces reflect a willingness for experimentation, and the church ceilings and courtyard walls are richly decorated in hieroglyph-like carved relief. Primitive metal tools are sharpened over a fire using bellows. The precision of the ceiling dome is achieved by fixing a piece of wood centrally in the rock. A piece of string is attached to the wooden spoke and used to mark out the circular dome. This method was quite possibly employed in older churches adorned with domes and cupolas. The excavation of rock and intricate relief carvings is done without artificial light. No drawings are used. So this is just to give you an idea of the space. So the top left is that image I showed you earlier, which was from 2015, and the image on the right is from 2017. So you can see it's the same space which has been excavated. And again, with these sort of very elaborate decorative carvings on the ceiling and upper walls. So yeah, the level of craftsmanship evident at Dagmari Lalibela, and indeed the phenomenon of newly carved churches throughout Ethiopia, reflects the level of craftsmanship alluded to by Richard Sennett. Every good craftsman conducts dialogue between concrete practices and thinking. This dialogue evolves into sustaining habits, and these habits establish a rhythm between problem solving and problem finding. So I'm going to quickly talk you through the Dagmari Lalibela complex. You can see that there's sort of these 5 churches. There's a lot of section drawings. So it's the largest sort of complex of churches, of new rock churches. So these are 2 long sections. The top 2015 and then 2017, and you can see sort of the ongoing excavation to the right of the image. And these are sort of sections from 2015. So again, just to show you the relationship of these courtyard spaces and churches within the natural rock. And then these images, this and the subsequent images are showing on the left 2015 and then 2017. So sort of comparing survey drawings. You can sort of see the ongoing excavation. So yeah, this is from the more recent trip in sort of February 2020, and you can see the top of these structures being covered over to protect them temporarily from the rain. And again, just so the more complete spaces. So I think, yeah, I might just talk through a few of these sort of sites. So this is Mariam Shuito, which I sort of showed you briefly earlier in Tigray. It's the largest site in Tigray that we've identified, still under excavation due to a lack of funds. But yeah, you can see in this church, so this is the one where they carved top downwards. So you can see on the right image, there's sort of all the slag which the craftsmen are using to stand on and sort of carve overhead. And again, here just to sort of highlight the use of charcoal to sort of mark out decorative features sort of as crosses. And this is another church, Medanyulem, in Tembiel. And on the right is an old church, which was very small and basically could no longer serve the community due to its size. So on the left is a new rock church which has been carved. And this was in 2016, sort of a view down the nave, and then 2019 when it's sort of complete and it's actually got the Bahara to box, so the altar has been placed in there. And it's just waiting to be consecrated. And this is another church just outside Hausen, which we've been visiting since 2015 every year. It's yeah, so this is funded by sort of the local community, and I guess they've really sort of struggled to have a stable income. So some churches are carved in as quick as a year. This is really sort of been drawn out due to the lack of funds. But on our last visit, we sort of arrived to find craftsmen working. And this is another church which was sort of only recorded in 2019. It's close to Adigrat, which makes it the out of the new rock churches, it's the furthest north that we've identified, so closer toward modern-day Eritrea. And again, just a view of the entrance. And here, again, you can see the craftsmen are working sort of bottom up, and you can see them sort of working away at this rock, and they've sort of carved these grooves to sort of chisel out a larger block of rock, which then on falling sort of breaks into smaller pieces and then can quite easily be removed. And this is a view in 2019, and sort of about a year later, you can see they've sort of removed all the slag or sort of stone, and that's sort of how it was about a year ago. This is another site in so near Ingashana, near to the other complex I showed you, and this craftsman is responsible for 4 other churches so far. So just really to give you a sense of these sort of spaces. Yeah, often really beautiful qualities of sort of natural light and actually the stone itself. So the entrance. And this is another church, and this is further south, so closer to Sanadingo. And I guess there's a couple of things that are interesting about this church. Firstly, it's funded by a patron from Addis. So it's maybe worth reiterating, in Bahara, most craftsmen tend to be sort of hermits, choose to distance themselves from sort of the community, go live in the mountains, and sort of have some sort of vision that they should carve a church. And in Tigray, it seems to be more sort of it's more sort of a contractual relationship. So the community sort of decides that they need a new church. There's then a discussion whether this should be built or rock, and the community then gets together and raises money, and there's sort of 4 or 5 laborers kind of working every day, as long as there's sort of a steady flow of money. But in this case, it's sort of the vision of a patron in Addis, and he's funding the whole church by himself, but he's not actually carving at all. But this, at least from what we've seen, it will be the largest church once it's complete. So at the moment, it's sort of a tunnel which is 30 meters deep, and the plan is for it to be 60 meters in the other direction. So yeah, I think I was going to say a little bit about documentation. I don't know if I'll. Yeah, I guess maybe I'm just sort of moving towards a close now, but I guess undertaking research in Ethiopia involves a level of bureaucracy, negotiation, and patience. So the physical and isolated location, aggravated by impassable roads in the rainy season and long journeys by foot, make reaching many churches a task in itself. Having obtained relevant paperwork and located a church, access may simply be denied on religious grounds. The irregular spaces of old and new rock churches alike make survey work far more complex than that of a regular built structure. Time and movement in inactive churches is often restricted, and spaces such as the Makdas or sanctuary rarely observed. So documentation of newly carved churches has the added complications of being virtually unknown and under excavation. People living in the surrounding areas are often unaware of the activity, and thus discovering new sites forms a large part of any expedition. That many churches are in a state of ongoing transformation, that the craftsmen use no architectural drawings and often believe they are fulfilling God's work, typically makes future development spontaneous and unpredictable. So in older churches that have undergone recent expansion, it is necessary to verify the accuracy of any existing drawings. Further investigation and study of older Rockhewn churches, previously recorded by the likes of Ruth Plant, may highlight a significant number of churches that have been subject to alteration in the past 45 years. This in turn may indicate whether the present craft represents revival or continuity. And so, yeah, I've added this quote by Galileo Galilei, and yeah, I think it's probably quite a sort of Western approach, the sort of idea of documenting and recording, or feeling like we have to record everything, which is definitely a big part of what's happened with the project. So, you know, sort of doing measured survey of churches, whereas non-Western culture is often sort of more happy to just sort of accept oral traditions as a sort of a way of recalling things. I think both have their value, and I think in this project, while these sort of the more sort of measurable aspects, sort of those drawings and that sort of thing has been really useful. I think the sort of anthropological almost approach, sort of going back and, you know, sort of seeing the same craftsman over a period of sort of 5-6 years has been really, really informative in sort of understanding the whole process. So yeah, this is an image, I think, from 2020 as well in Tambien. So having sort of visited a church, being offered traditional beer, such as swap or tala, with sort of very basic injera, and just sort of, you know, it's very, very sort of customary to kind of share a meal at sort of almost every church you visit. So I think to conclude, the present craft demonstrates how in the absence of written or oral record, architecture itself has the ability to embody knowledge. Old rock churches serve as the inspiration for new ones. Their sheer existence warrants the creation of a new church possible and provokes inquiry as to how this might be achieved. Without such precedent or religious fervour, it is quite inconceivable that clergymen and craftsmen of 21st century Ethiopia might choose to hand chisel churches from solid rock. Thank you.
Thank you, Tarn, for that presentation. That was very interesting, I think. And I'm sure some of our audiences have expressed how interesting they found it. So I think I'm going to start with my question first.
Sure.
You said that there were 2 types of carvings that were used from top to bottom and from bottom to top.
Yeah.
What's the difference between the 2 things?
What's the difference between them? So effectively, if you sort of imagine a cliff face, I guess what sort of historians or sort of experts on older Rockhewn churches have always sort of imagined that it was top to bottom excavation, which in Lalibela definitely makes sense, and the reason there are these sort of tunnels and interconnected passages is a lot to do with sort of drainage of these sort of courtyard spaces while they're being carved. I guess to use the example of sort of a church carved in a cliff in a rock face, in sort of a horizontal rock face. I think previously what was sort of commonly assumed was that the craftsman would enter through what would become a window and then sort of carve the inside of the church and the outside simultaneously. What we found now with some of the new churches is that they're actually entering through what will be the entrance and then using this, carving in and using the rock as it falls away, standing on that and working overhead, so kind of burrowing upwards rather than downwards. That was sort of the point I was trying to make. I don't know if it answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Next question is from Liam Phillip. He asks, he states first that very interesting session. Thank you, Tarn. He asks, are the Rockhewn churches unique to Ethiopia, or are they found in other countries in Africa?
So yeah, it's possibly should have said it's important to note that the Rockhewn architecture is found throughout the ancient world, so as far sort of east as China. I think there are rock churches in sort of Armenia, places like that, France, Italy. In Africa itself, I don't think there's Rockhewn churches in Egypt. There's definitely temples and sort of the sort of religious structures. I think, yeah. So yes and no. Rockhewn architecture is definitely very prevalent in the ancient world. I don't think there's anywhere else where there's where it's a continued tradition, as far as I know, in this sort of way.
Okay, I hope that answers your questions, Liam. Chloe asks, what do you think is the driving all these churches, increased population or increased Christian population? I think you briefly mentioned there was a financial incentive for the craftsmanship, so is increasing wealth a part of it?
I don't know. Again, sorry, I think I missed the first question.
She says, what do you think is driving all these new churches, increased population or increasing Christian population?
Sure.
I think you briefly mentioned there was a financial incentive for the craftsmanship, so is increasing wealth a part of it?
Yeah, I think, thanks, Leigh. I think that the primary reason is, the primary motivation is religious. So I think I tried to convey that religion in Ethiopia, or Christianity, at least in northern Ethiopia, is really, really dominant. It affects everyday life, in sort of many aspects of life. So I think, yeah, to people in Ethiopia, it's sort of quite normal that you would be contributing money to a church. That sort of thing. And I don't think people. I don't think it's got sort of a commercial aspect to it. I think it's more sort of purely
spiritual, perhaps.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Another question from Jessica. What is your opinion on a potential invasion by Western tourist industry, commercialization, and impacts on local communities?
Yeah, so I think that's a very good point. I think, if anyone who's been to Lalibela, it's sort of, I guess for me, there's kind of a bit of a conflict. It's an incredible place to visit, but I think the Lalibela as a town and the site itself has sort of, I would say, very much been destroyed by tourism. Sort of the numbers that, so sort of in the 50s, you used to have to go there by mule, so it was sort of a 7-day journey, and it wasn't that sort of accessible to foreigners. I mean, now, people might go to Ethiopia for 2 days and they'll fly up from Addis to go and see, if there's one thing people will see in Ethiopia, it'll be the churches at Lalibela. And it does mean that, that's sort of, the whole town in Lalibela, it's not even, it's sprawled incredibly even over the sort of the last few years that I've been going there. But it does mean there's a very high dependence on tourism, and I think I always worry about that, particularly. I mean, you can see so the scenario we're in now is pandemic. Yeah, it can be very problematic in many ways.
Okay. Matthew, your question is a lot, so maybe if you could turn on your mic and ask Tarn directly, because you seem to be pointing at a lot of points, and I think it's best you address him straight on. But until then, I will proceed to Greg, who is asking, is there any danger to the carvers from rock falls during excavation?
Potentially. We haven't, so actually the, I guess, sort of health-related issues, one of them is sort of the dust from carving these spaces. So we have had reports of sort of, craftsmen getting very sick just from sort of breathing in this kind of dust. Also, depending on whether it's during the rainy season, they can become quite damp as well during construction, which sort of has that sort of health issue, but not, as far as we know, there haven't been any sort of accidents or fatalities from carving itself.
Okay. So another question is from Danyacho. He asks, thanks, Tarn, very interesting presentation. The detailed drawings of the ongoing constructions I found very intriguing. How precise are they, and were there modern instruments used to take the measurements?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So in 2015, I just used measuring tape, and since then I've used a laser, which is sort of slightly modern, but I would say it's still quite simple. And we have sort of talked about using, I guess, sort of more advanced technologies, sort of like 3D scanners and that kind of thing. And I think personally, for me, it doesn't feel appropriate to these spaces, which are sort of hand carved in darkness without drawing sort of over sort of years. It doesn't feel appropriate to me to sort of go in there and do kind of a 3D scan. So I've measured them all, I would say, to quite a level of detail. But yeah, sort of using a laser. So I would draw up the plan and sections of the building, or just on paper, and then I'll normally have at least 2 or 3 different colors of pen to sort of take measurements for sort of, say, all the actual dimensions, so sort of like shafts and that sort of thing, but then also the dimensions between shafts as well as column heights and all that sort of thing. So I would say they are fairly accurate.
Okay, we have Matthew here. So Matthew, if you could ask your questions directly.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much. I was interested in what you said about how this exhaustive documentation creates a kind of knowledge base about these churches that is not necessarily faithful to the way that they are remembered as part of a tradition locally. But I guess thinking about that and the slide you put up about the question of embodiment, where do you think the knowledge about and understanding of these churches really resides? Is it in, the rock, something between the rock and the people who make them? Or is it in the culture? Because it's a very interesting phenomenon, and I wonder how best to be faithful to it as a researcher.
Yeah, Matthew, nice to see you. I think that's a big question, and I don't know if I have sort of the complete answer. I think so. If you think of somewhere like Mali or something like that, where you've got sort of the mosque at Jannah, where there's sort of a guild, a hereditary sort of guild of masons that kind of pass down a kind of a technique or sort of information or ideas. In this case, due to the fact that there seems to have been sort of a break, at least, that there's not that at all. So when I talk about embodied knowledge, I sort of see that, I guess, both the fact that religion is so dominant and present in Ethiopia, I see that as a major factor. But coupled with the factor that there are rock-hewn churches, sort of, so people in Tigray, for example, there's about 150 rock-hewn churches. So it's not anything. It's a normal thing if you've grown up there. It is. I think largely part of Ethiopian kind of life and culture. I don't know if that's. But yeah, it's a big one.
Okay, Matthew, was your question answered before you leave? Okay, so glad to hear that. Another question, Tarn, I have for you is in regards to the Dagmari Lalibela church you were talking about.
Yeah.
That is still going on excavation, as you mentioned, if I'm correct, right?
Yes. So I don't know if that's a question. Is that the full question? Or?
No, not yet.
Okay. Yes. So it is and it isn't.
Yeah. So there's already 5 churches. Is there more to it yet, or are you just looking into the 5 churches at the moment?
So yeah, I think maybe when I was reading, I don't know how clear it was, but it's a very interesting site, and the craftsman is very interested. It's very sort of interesting. He's got a very sort of social and political agenda, but he's effectively trying to replicate Lalibela. So his idea is to carve 10 churches on site, and there's an old cave sort of just behind where the new churches are, which he claims was carved by Lalibela as well, by King Lalibela. So effectively, he's going to have 11 churches, which it clearly sort of mirrors the complex at Lalibela. So yeah, no, I've sort of been going there every year since 2015, and maybe this relates a little bit to what we're talking about, sort of tourism and documentation. This site it's close to Gashena, and there's something called Tesfa Trekking, which is sort of an organization where I guess quite sort of out there tourists kind of go in and do sort of trekking around the area, but someone sort of cottoned on to that this site has been carved, and in recent years there has been sort of an influx of foreign tourists, not many in comparison to sort of other sites, but actually also a lot of people from Addis, from Waldia, from other places. You know, I've been there. I think in 2015 I was by myself there, just sort of measuring, and next thing about 50 school students arrived from Waldia. So sorry, I kind of got slightly off track, but I think to answer the first bit of the question, that the intention is that there would be 10 churches. So far there are 5, which are more or less complete. But on our last trip, there seems to have been a fallout between the priest and sort of the church community, or the better connect. So he actually was nowhere to be found, and we don't actually know what the clear sort of situation is, but people weren't very willing to sort of tell us what had happened. But there seems to have been a fallout between him and the church authorities in Moldia.
Okay. So aside from the fallout, how long do you think it will take to completely excavate the entire area? And
yes, so I mean, these churches, they're not as large as Lalibela. They are smaller, and I guess it's important to note that the rock is quite soft, so it's almost like a clay deposit. It's quite sort of malleable. He was sort of working with the help of 2 deacons. They were carving a church a year, pretty much at that sort of rate. So yeah, I think if he was able to continue, he could say within 5 years probably complete his vision. Just to note, he has had quite a lot of coverage within Ethiopia. So when I was there last time, he was actually on EBC, which is one of the local. I was in a restaurant, and an interview with him came up. So he has been quite well documented in sort of in Ethiopia. But I don't know if that's contributed to the reason that there's been some sort of a fallout or whatever.
Yeah. So like you're conducting various research. So what's your next step? Which sector are you looking forward to continuing now?
Yes, I think. I mean, my journey with Ethiopia, from sort of a research perspective, started with a dissertation in 2014, and that kind of led to applying for funding through the Adam Architecture Scholarship, and sort of one thing's kind of led to another. It's sort of part of it's happened by chance in some ways. I think I feel very sort of connected with Ethiopia, and do see myself continuing to sort of be involved in similar projects. I think it's very specific. I think in terms of sort of tying up this research, the idea, so a lot of this information is now online, but the idea would be to sort of make some form of publication as well. sort of further ahead, you know, I don't know, watch the space, something like that.
Well, I'll be sure to keep an eye out. I think Viniam has something to say. Go on, Viniam.
Just a couple of remarks, maybe. First of all, thank you, Tarn. It was really fascinating, especially to hear about the new and ongoing excavations. One thing in terms of technicality, one question I have is, do this craftsmen I mean, like, we're in a time where architecture is like really, you have to draw something, you know, but so do these guys prepare something in advance, what they want to achieve, or do they craft as they go along? How does it unfold?
Yeah, so no, it's a really good question. I think I was really surprised at the Dagmari Complex when I arrived there to learn that there were no drawings. And I guess it's important again to reiterate, he's sort of guided by a vision. You know, he sort of had a vision. He's sort of, yeah, I mean, he's effectively doing God's work, let's say, and maybe doesn't actually know what's sort of happening. I think it's particularly with the sort of decorative carving. I think that sort of just kind of happens. But I think I think out of the 40 sites, I think there's one site where we were shown sort of a rough kind of almost diagram of what they were sort of trying to do, but often there's no drawings at all. I guess in Tigray, where there are a lot of sort of precedent examples nearby, it's quite common that they'll say we're carving a church similar to this church, or this is the motivation. So it's sort of, there's something to go by, but no, often there's no drawings, which again, makes my role kind of interesting. Like, it's sort of a whole inversion of, these churches are made without any architectural drawings, and then I'm going along afterwards. And can I say one last little quick thing that I think possibly relates to Biniam, because I know he's, I think, got quite a keen interest in some materials. I think, in terms of thinking about the research, I mean, it's probably interesting to note that, thinking about sustainability, this is quite an innovative sort of way of, working with materials. So the materials on site, there's no transportation. There's all these sorts of things as well. So just put that out there. But, yeah.
Okay. Binny, do you have something to add to that, or?
No, nothing really. I think we really are running out of time. So perhaps maybe I'll just make a remark or reflection as to what I wish I would have heard more about in this talk. That is perhaps the soft aspect of this, the craftspeople, like their way of life, and then like what they do. I mean, you mentioned, for instance, they work on this church very sporadically due to funding and other contingencies. It would be interesting to work to know if they are actually craftspeople working on other things, and like also if it talking to them, if it kind of hints into the genealogy of like how it happened, maybe explain this, what seemingly is like, I mean, not seemingly, practically a very huge gap from where it started and where this resurgence happens. So I think it would be very interesting to see this aspect, should you continue with this in the future. I guess that's what I want to just mention.
Okay. I think on that note, we should wrap it up because we've passed our mark. It's we've passed 10 minutes. So I think I should wrap it up. That's okay with you, everyone. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you. Thank you, Tarn, again, for this enlightening presentation. I'm sure everybody found it very informative and entertaining. I'd also like to mention that we are having our next talk on the June 3rd by Rumi Okazaki, titled Actualities of Historical Cities in Ethiopia. Registration link is available in our social media accounts. And just as a reminder, we have the link on the chat below to become a member or to support Intival in any way or form you can. So be sure to check that out. And I think that's it for this talk today. Thank you, everyone. So have a good night.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tarn.
Bye.
Thank you.